Good evening everyone and welcome to Talking Till Dawn. I'm Mike and I'm joined as always by the Warlock of the West End, Mr. Martin Yates.
I like that.
How are you?
I'm good, I'm really good. I am looking forward to this. I've got my mouth stuffed with feathers and chicken bones.
I hope that's a reference to the witchcraft in the previous episode and not just something you do.
Yeah, of course.
I just stuffed chicken bones in my mouth.
You'd hear it. It would cause us all kinds of technical issues. Chicken bones at the back of my throat. Feathers. Actually, maybe that would, the little wet mouth noises that I sometimes have to edit out. Maybe stuffing my mouth with feathers would dry it out.
Yeah, but then you'd sound like Rumple of the Bailey. There's a reference for you, Martin, that no one's going to get.
1950s topical references.
I'm from a different age. Okay, so before we begin, I want to thank all of our Patreon subscribers. We're really grateful for all of you and you help keep the lights on.
Yes, and specifically, we would like to thank our new patrons, Amelie Arsenault and Barn Ninny, who join us at the Nightbird level.
Yes, and a big thank you to each and every one of you. If you want to help support the show and get some exclusive content from us, including the occasional deleted clip and bonus episode, head on over to patreon.com/talking till dawn. The link is in the show notes below.
We have some belters on there actually. I was listening to some of them the other day.
Yeah, there's some funny stuff as well. There's some good laughs to be had.
And there's some absolute shite as well. But that's all part of the fun.
So this episode is part 2 of our investigation into the Paisley Witch trials, which took place at the tail end of the 1600s. My apologies for it taking so long to get round to part 2, but this has been quite a behemoth of a case to investigate. It's a grim historical event, allegedly involving possession, witchcraft, the devil, a curse that some believe continues to this day, and, most tragically of all, the persecution of several individuals who were very likely nothing to do with the entire thing. I urge you to check out part 1 first before you proceed, so you know all of the strange and frightening claims surrounding the child Christian Shaw and the phenomena reported around her. Also, this episode deals with persecution, torture, suicide and executions, so if any of these topics will negatively impact your mental well-being, feel free to turn off the show and listen to a less grim episode. We do have them.
There's about 3 of them.
Yeah, I know. As I always say, I'm fascinated by the weird and the macabre, true crime, but I quite often make the decision to switch off from these things periodically for my own well-being, so please don't feel bad if you wish to do the same.
I like to cover myself in cooking oil and listen to the nastiest episodes I can find. Not really.
I bet you do.
Many a true thing said in jest.
An important thing to remember, because we'll return to this later, is that the source material we're drawing this account from is primarily the book A History of the Witches of Renfrewshire. Now, since we recorded the first part, I found other editions of the book, and most of these are scans from various archives, and it did actually make me wonder about the authorship of it. The earliest version I can see dates back to 1809, and as best I can tell it was put together by a man named John Miller. But the wording of the publication details in some of the other editions is a little cryptic to my 21st century eyes, so if someone wants to correct me on the author, please do. And bear in mind this author, because we're going to come back to them at the end of this episode. The book includes documents from the local presbytery in Paisley where Christian Shaw's case was recorded. These records were written down around the time of the case in the late 1600s and were recorded by ministers of the church. As we mentioned in the first episode, research in this case it feels very much like a Lovecraftian investigation, because the entries are written in a diary format, meticulously recording the dates as they progress. Can imagine a minister writing down this incredible account by candlelight, looking over his shoulder at the shadows behind and wondering if he just saw something move.
What's the name for that one? Is it epistolary novel?
Epistolary, yeah. Yeah, that's right. Like Dracula.
Epistolary, yeah.
Yeah. But the truth of the case is far removed from fiction, and sadly isn't a cosy affair. It's a brutal one. So let's return to 1697, February 4th, Christian Shaw, an 11-year-old girl and heir to the Bargarin estate in Renfrewshire, Scotland, had endured months of alleged visitations by invisible people, demons and the devil himself. She had often refused to name her tormentors, partly out of fear and partly because she would have seizures whenever she tried. By the 4th of February, however, she had finally named some of those she believed to be involved, and an official investigation of the case began. A commission was granted by, as the documents call it, His Majesty's Most Honourable Privy Council, allowing a noble lord and some worthy gentlemen to make inquiry. Now this doesn't exactly sound legally rigorous, does it? How were they deemed worthy? In any case, several persons were quickly arrested due to this investigation. We mentioned the old man who arrived at Bargarin House in the previous episode, weary and looking for somewhere to stay. Christian Shaw claimed he was in on the conspiracy, so he was arrested. Alexander Anderson, described as an ignorant, irreligious fellow who had been always of evil fame, was imprisoned. This sounds very much like the rounding up of an atheist to me, but it could also be that he committed the terrible sin of not conforming to Christian standards. Irreligious is used to mean hostile to religion, or of no religion.
You get someone who's making these claims and pointing the finger at various people, and who knows, maybe there's undesirables in the community that the authorities would quite like to be shot of, but haven't actually got them on anything. It's like, maybe we could get this person who's naming names to maybe name the names we would like to be named, you know, who knows.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of that going on here. It's quite possible that they would also use this term irreligious for someone practicing something outside of Christianity.
Or just somebody who didn't go to church enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Alexander Anderson's daughter, Elizabeth Anderson, suspected of being a witch, was arrested, and Elizabeth's grandmother, Jean Fulton, described as an old scandalous woman accused for hideous cursing and imprecating mischief upon several persons, which had been followed with fatal events. If you cast your mind back to the first episode, the two people initially accused of being witches, the maid Catherine Campbell, who is already imprisoned at this point, and Agnes Naismith, an old woman who was brought in front of the child Christian Shaw and forced to pray for her, that their crimes were similar to Jean Fulton's. Most notably, it had been observed by people in the surrounding area that a few people Agnes Naismith had disliked had suddenly died. So, in a time when mortality would have been common, if you were A, poor, B, old, C, happened to get into an argument with someone, and D, that person then died at some point afterwards, you could quite easily have found yourself being called a witch.
It must have been quite a difficult time to live in when you would both hope your enemies died and hope they didn't die, because if you hoped that they died and then they did die, you could then die.
That's easy for you to say. Once imprisoned, Elizabeth Anderson made the claim that Jean Fulton, her grandmother, had been frequently visited by the devil. Elizabeth described him as, and I quote, a small black man who usually did vanish on a sudden within the walls of the house when anybody came to the door. Now, the language here describing the devil as a small black man probably had a different meaning back then as it does now. The term black, especially in Scotland, was often used interchangeably, I believe with evil, malevolent, or simply meaning, as is described in the British National Dictionary from 1825, a vulgar designation for a low scoundrel.
It also often meant someone with black hair.
Really? I didn't know that.
I think you see that in names that people are given, like, you know, Henry the Black, or, you know, these kinds of names. The Red, would have been someone with red hair.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. A couple of hundred years earlier than this, it was also used to mean extreme and overpowering in a negative sense, which, other than what you've just said, Martin, I think is the reason some figures from Scotland's history sometimes have the nickname Black before their real names, but I could be wrong about that. There is some suggestion that this term black comes from blackguard, who were people who would carry the coal, so be covered in soot at the rear of a royal convoy. When I was younger, if you were insulted for not being very clean, you could be called black, and the term might also be connected to the word blackguard as well. It's just that it's a descriptive term that comes up quite a bit, and I wanted to clarify that for our listeners, especially people who didn't grow up in Scotland. So yeah, enough of that rabbit hole. That description of a small man who, given this older meaning of appearing dirty or covered in soot, made me wonder if it wasn't a lie or hallucination. We know of modern accounts where it's turned out someone was living in crawl spaces, attics, cellars, and in the walls. Could someone have seen someone hiding in the walls of Jean Fulton's home and then she just get blamed for it?
Could also be that, you know, people in these days didn't have medical understanding of mental illness, and if she had schizophrenia or she had, you know, delusions would have been quite common, or hallucinations, things like that, and they wouldn't necessarily have been given a medical explanation.
No.
People hallucinated because they ate grain that was tainted with whatever, and they had every manner, every possible stripe of mental health issue people have today. They existed in those times as well, but there was no recognition or understanding of that.
Yeah.
Except in supernatural terms very often.
Yeah.
I think there was maybe just beginning to have some understanding of mental illness as a problem, as a sickness, but among the general population, probably not very much.
What's interesting is that following this case then leads into a period where it's first established in France. Witch burnings and executions and trials are actually abandoned because, for the exact reason, we can't delineate between a natural cause and a supernatural cause. But that hadn't happened here yet, unfortunately. Now this is where things start to take an even more sinister turn. The accusation by Elizabeth against her grandmother was only made after intervention. Here's a quote from one of the documents describing these events. Elizabeth at first most obstinately denied accession any manner of way to the sin of witchcraft, until afterwards, when seriously importuned and dealt with in the prison by two gentlemen. We can only imagine that this most probably refers to some sort of torture, at the very least emotional and psychological, and given the time in which this case took place, most likely physical as well. Elizabeth confessed to having been present at several meetings with the devil and witches after this. She then accused her own father and the old Highland man who had visited Bargarin of both being there at these meetings, and that both of them were instrumental in Christian Shaw's visitations and attacks.
I like that term, present at these meetings with the devil. Like he's, so my secretary Eleanor is going to be taking the minutes. If you've got any questions. First some housekeeping.
Office drinks after this, of course,
Fire exits, down the hall to the left.
There's a lovely bar down the street. It's called Purgatory. You'll enjoy it. Now it's claimed here that Elizabeth Anderson was able to describe scars or marks that were on the old Highland man's body to back up her, more than likely coerced, accusations. Elizabeth couldn't even give the old man's name, but she pointed to him when he was brought out in front of her and other witnesses and claimed he was involved in Christian Shaw's torment. These types of confessions were very common and were used at the time, and tragically I have to say up until fairly recent times, to condemn innocent people of crimes they did not commit. I don't have any definitive proof, but it seems reasonable to believe that Elizabeth was told about the marks on the old man's body and coerced to describing them in front of other witnesses as evidence.
Did you see the mole on his balls, yes or no?
Yeah. He has a tattoo of a sailor on his left buttock. After this, a commission was set up at the House of Bargarin itself, the home of Christian Shaw and her wealthy family. Not exactly a neutral venue. There, Elizabeth Anderson went on to name again her own father, Agnes Naismith, the original accused, Margaret Fulton, and a boy by the name of James Lindsay, or Thomas Lindsay. We're going to get back to that later. There is some confusion about the names here of the accused. But the boy whose second name was Lindsay had the alias of, I think I'm pronouncing this right, but curate or curate. Now this word, I did a little bit of digging and it seems to be an older word for cuirass, which is a piece of armour covering the chest and back of a human, or as the outer protective shell, plate or scales covering the body of an animal. I'm not certain if this word had witchcraft implications though. Something that covered an animal's body, a protective layer, could easily be seen as something that legendary arsehole Charles Manson would call a bit witchy. I did wonder if the protective element was something to do with a coven of witches, that maybe an individual would be given that title, someone casting protective spells for the group.
Apparently that piece of armour is pronounced cuirass.
Cuirass, right?
Cuirass.
Why did you say it like that?
No, because it's like French originally, so it has
right.
it has an emphasis on the last syllable, cuirass. At least that's how the first video that popped up on Google pronounces it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if this name was used about the sort of protective layer because, you know, maybe it was a title given to someone within the coven casting protective spells, but I couldn't find anything to back that up. I think it's an interesting idea, though. It could just be this guy had the wrong nickname and lived in the wrong community at the wrong time. Elizabeth Anderson also named John Lindsay, who had the alias Bishop. He was the brother of James Lindsay, as far as I can tell. Again, is this a pseudo-religious term? It was often believed that satanic practices involved the inversion and mockery of Christian practices, and in fact, an introduction appearing in the later 1877 edition of A History of the Witches of Renfrewshire makes the case that witchcraft, as something that's antithetical to Judeo-Christian traditions, has been around in parallel to it for countless centuries, and that, controversially, there can be no Bible without the recording of witches. In front of the commission, which included the powerful Lord Blantyre, each of the accused, with the exception of Bishop, who wasn't present, were asked to touch Christian Shaw. Each time, Christian went into a fit. This was compared to others present who were able to lay their hands on Christian Shaw without anything happening. Again, this was taken as proof that the accused were Christian's tormentors. It was also noted that the very worst fit occurred when the maid Catherine Campbell, the original alleged witch, touched Christian. When Catherine Campbell, supposedly confused by the child's reaction, finally uttered a Christian blessing of "The Lord God of heaven and earth bless thee and save thee both soul and body," Christian claimed to hear a voice from above her telling her that she had been set loose from the tormentors and that they could now touch her without causing any further fits. However, Christian would still have episodes otherwise.
It reminds me a little bit of, you know, these, what's the word, like these churches where people collapse on the ground and roll around on the floor.
Yeah.
I forget what the groups are called. You know the ones I mean?
Yeah, it's a form of evangelical, is it not?
Yeah, but it's like people psych themselves up into a religious ecstasy almost. They're so wrapped up in it. It's almost got like a psychosomatic effect or something. So I wonder if it's something similar to that, especially if these people have been tortured and maybe repeatedly like, admit that you are a witch, admit that you are a witch, bow down to the Lord God, blah blah blah, and, you know, bombarded with this for maybe hours or days, you know, and they're just so primed and ready to freak out. Who knows, you know? Yeah,
there's definitely the possibility. I do speak about it a little bit later on, but there definitely is the possibility of a lot of psychological goings on here to cause the types of behaviour that Christian is undergoing. The disembodied voice from above Christian's head, she at least contended, was the same voice that had revealed the names of her attackers to her. I think we're to infer here that this is some sort of angelic or heavenly intervention, but there's no direct mention of that. Despite this, the Bible is replete with messages from God and from the angels to humankind, and this yet again fits into those stories. I also think that in these accounts they couldn't have God as an absent force, because that would go against what was taught in the church. On February 6th, the very next day, Christian had a terrible fit and the spectators claimed to see invisible orange pills being slipped into Christian's mouth, which she then chewed in agony. Her throat bloated up and she fell down as though dead and went stiff. She then suddenly recovered from the ordeal. Christian claimed that, and I quote, "Oh, it was a very sweet orange pill which I got from the gentlewoman." She did not name this person, but said she was accompanied by Margaret, one of the invisible attackers, but would not give the second name out of fear of reprisals. She did give her nickname, which was Pinched Maggie.
Oof.
How's
Sounds like something you'd see the doctor about.
The list of accused then grew. A local young boy called Thomas Lindsay. This is where some of the confusion comes in. There's a lot of people here with the second name Lindsay. The reporting of it gets confused and muddled, so bear that in mind, but we will address that later on. So Thomas Lindsay, who wasn't even 12 years old yet, was arrested for witchcraft. He had apparently told people in the community that he was the son of the devil, and that he could turn into something resembling a crow and fly through the air when he wished. It was said this crow-like form would attach itself to the masts of ships. Thomas was also said to have made a horse break free from its plough with a few satanic words, and the animal would then turn itself around widdershins. Wider or widdershins is an old word meaning counterclockwise, and it was seen as being the reverse of how the sun moved. This therefore was a satanic, unnatural movement, and Thomas was said to have carried this feat out several times for anyone who paid him a penny. This sounds remarkably to me like a boy who had trained a horse to move in a specific way with some simple commands rather than witchcraft. Maybe with childlike imagination he had made up some incantations for showmanship, and now he was being called a witch.
Yeah, it sounds like something you would get at like the local fair or something.
Absolutely. Thomas denied he was involved in any witchcraft until he suddenly confessed to having received the mark of the devil after making a pact with Satan himself. This mark was apparently there for several to see on the boy's body. Now the devil's mark is also known as the witch's mark, and it was a common way for people to be found guilty of being a witch. It's possible that this is one of the very last times this accusation was used so publicly, as the witch's mark was used commonly between the 1500s and 1600s, peaking around 1645. By 1700, according to Richard M. Golden's Encyclopedia of Witchcraft, the Western tradition, it had all but died out. And of course this trial is happening just 3 years before that. A note here, the term witch's mark and witch mark refer to two different things. Witch mark refers to a carved symbol. Those symbols take several forms and can be found from the medieval period onwards, but especially during the 1800s, where they were carved into the stonework of buildings to protect them from evil.
So these were like gargoyle type things. You carved something scary on the outside of the building to scare away evil spirits.
Absolutely.
But it wasn't considered witchcraft in itself to do that, presumably.
No, the witch mark wasn't. If anything, it was to keep evil at bay, but I think also it was probably one of these things that just became fashionable.
Yeah.
Those marks, the witch mark can also be used in occult practices, but it's widely seen as being used as a good luck charm. So we're not talking about a witch mark, we are talking about the witch's mark. Confusing, I know, but I wanted to clarify that in case anyone wasn't sure what I was talking about. Probably just muddied the water even more. I can't find a description of the mark on the young boy Thomas in these records, but legend has it that the witch's or devil's mark was usually a clawed scar, as if the devil had raked his claws across his servant's skin, or a blue or red brand, much like a hot iron.
Or like a stretch mark.
Yeah, exactly. Other descriptions claim that the devil would lick his tongue across the person's skin, leaving a permanent death skull pattern.
Ooh.
I had a thought about that actually, which may be a long shot, but anyone who has a cat, and you have a cat, Martin, you have a cat, will know the rough feeling when being licked by them because of the curved hollow-tipped spines in their tongues. Like, with black cats so closely linked to witches, I wondered whether there was a loose link to they being licked by the devil and a mark being left. It seems tenuous, but there are records of the Pilgrims, for example, travelling to the New World, and they brought with them a belief that black cats were companions to witches, and even familiars clothing themselves in the form of a black cat. In our own mythologies here in Scotland, there is a creature known as the cat Sif. Not a Star Wars reference, but a fairy that takes the form of a black cat that steals a person's soul. Pirates used to believe that if a black cat walked onto a ship and then back off of it while at port, the ship was ultimately doomed to sink. And as an aside...
Because cats were supposed to be able to see things people couldn't, so the cat coming on the ship's like, oh no, this ship's going to sink, I'm out of here.
I never even thought of that. That's brilliant. I never even thought of it in that way. I thought of it more like it's a malevolent thing and it's like cursing the ship when it goes on. That's fascinating.
The funny thing is, depending on where you go, black cats either have positive or negative connotations. In a lot of cultures, black cats are bad luck. In Scotland, they are in fact good luck. A black cat crossing your path is considered like a really good omen by superstitious people in Scotland, which is completely the opposite to what it is in a lot of other countries, a lot of other European countries.
I got taught the opposite. I got taught that black cats were bad luck.
Traditionally, in most of Europe, black cats were bad luck. But in Scotland, traditionally speaking, maybe not when you were a kid in the 50s, but traditionally speaking...
I'm 4 years older than you, mate. I'm 4 years older than you.
Traditionally speaking, black cats were considered specifically good luck in Scotland.
As an aside to this aside, there were mass burnings of cats and bonfires across Europe, which as an animal lover is horrendous, but you can see how seriously people took the perceived threat of a black cat. The mythology and supernatural claims surrounding black cats is an episode in of itself, but I did wonder, while going through these old notes, if Thomas, who may, as we've established, have been an animal lover himself, could he have had a mark on his body left from a cat or other animal since he was in close proximity with them? I know it's a leap, but an interesting one, so I thought I'd mention it.
Probably just had a mole or something that looked like a...
Aye.
a skull or
that's it.
Whatever.
The witch's mark is also often used interchangeably with the witch's teat, which is a raised, wart-like bump somewhere on a witch's skin. This, as is often pointed out, was seen as a perversion of a mother's teat, and was said to be used to nourish malevolent creatures, imps, or familiars, sometimes in the form of a black cat, as they suckled on the witch's blood.
People can have superfluous nipples, and they can appear over a range of different parts of your body. Like there are people with nipples on their thigh, on their neck. It's...
No, man, I've got one.
No, you don't.
I'll show it to you.
I don't want to see your nipples. Where?
Well, I don't know if it's that, right? But I've got a strange mark on my chest that has always been there since I was a kid, and it looks
it's probably a mole.
It's weird because it's like kind of flattish, but it doesn't look like a mole at all. It looks like it looks like a tiny nipple.
Maybe.
So I don't know.
Get it pierced.
But no. Maybe I'm sharing too much. Now everyone's going to think I'm a witch. Incidentally, how would someone differentiate between a witch's teat and, let's say, a big wart? That was the job of, and I'm not making this up, the witch pricker. This was a man... This was a man who would prick the witch's teat with a pin.
Okay.
If the witch felt no pain, or there was no blood, then a witch they be. Over 80% of all accused witches were women, but 20% were men, and even they could carry the witch's teat.
So wait. All they had to do was go, that hurt?
Yeah.
Aye. And they're off scot-free?
Aye, or if there's no blood, so they could...
right.
I'm not completely trained as a witch pricker. I'm not sure it's a career path these days, but this is what I read about it anyway. For Thomas, it sounds more like this was a mark or brand type of devil's mark. During Thomas's confession, he stated that he had met with the devil and other witches several times at sinister meetings. Thomas said that his brother James, and again these names are going to get confusing later on, was present at those meetings, and he also identified others including Elizabeth Anderson. Now the account of this confession says that after it was extracted from Thomas, he was then held in custody at Bargarin House itself, the large country home of Christian Shaw and her family, where most of the alleged phenomena had taken place. Again, that doesn't exactly seem like an overly objective way to process accused prisoners, but a lot of them were held there.
Also, if I thought that you were placing supernatural curses on me, I probably wouldn't want to imprison you in my house.
Yeah, probably not. A search was carried out at the behest of Lord Bargarin to find Thomas's elder brother James. Christian Shaw had identified him as the one she referred as, and I may mispronounce this, Glade or squint-eyed elf is how she referred to him. To gley is an old Scots word to mean sideway glance.
Gleyed, of persons having a cast in the eye or being squint-eyed. Oh, it's glide. The EYE is eye, so glide.
Right. James Lindsay was caught and denied any involvement, but then a neighbour minister named Patrick Simpson got the confession out of him. There were a lot of ministers involved in these confessions, incidentally. To make James's story even more tragic, he was found at the Glasgow toll booth, say it again, which I believe is the Trongate in Glasgow's East End, where he had been imprisoned for being homeless, and he was going to be sent away to a plantation, essentially as a slave. We're now on February 11th, 1697. Throughout these investigations, Christian Shaw's torment continued. Her claims and the claims of those around her did not cease. She was still being allegedly tortured by the coven of witches. At the local church, Christian explained that she had been told by the devil the night before that an old man would be tormented at the church. His peruke, a type of wig, would fall off, he would stumble, and he would break his neck. This prediction did not happen. You would think that would suggest Christian wasn't receiving messages from the devil, but no, instead it was used to prove that the devil is a liar and cannot be trusted. How wild is that?
Okay.
How wild is that? No matter what's being said or what's being presented, people had already made up their mind.
Unfalsifiable.
Exactly. Christian also claimed that during some of the services at the church, she saw strange spectres that were invisible to all others. Once home, more biblical passages were read out and Christian had a terrible fit. Blood poured out of her clenched mouth, and when those in attendance were able to finally open her mouth, they found that one of her teeth was missing. Witnesses claimed that the tooth must have been drawn out through some unknown means. But if Christian was epileptic and having fits regularly, as we did talk about in the previous episode, it's not beyond the realm of chance that she broke a tooth which produced the blood, and then she swallowed the tooth during the episode.
Yeah. And then by witchcraft, a tooth appeared in her shit.
The cursed shit of Christian Shaw. I'm just imagining the front of a book, an old pulp book, like a Dennis Wheatley book or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's just got a big turd.
Golden Boss title and a Golden Boss little turd with a tooth sticking out of it.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. On February 12th, Christian Shaw was visited, apparently voluntarily, by Margaret Lang and her daughter, Martha Semple. The text is a little obscure here, but it's either that both had been named as conspirators by Christian Shaw and those who had already been arrested, or alternatively that the daughter alone had been accused. It's probable that they knew what had happened to the other individuals who were now in custody, with word reaching them that they had been named, and so they arrived at Bargarin House to nullify this threat, which would be quite understandable.
At that stage when she's starting to point fingers and name these dozens of people, many of whom don't even know each other, I would be skipping town.
Move to the colonies.
Yeah, gone.
During this visit, there were a number of fits, and Christian Shaw refused to name Margaret Lang as one of her spiritual attackers, but did say her daughter was involved. When Margaret Lang then said a prayer for the child, she said her mouth had been loosened, and she was now able to say that Margaret Lang was also one of the conspirators. Christian claimed that the reason she had been unable to name Margaret Lang to her face there and then was because Margaret had made a charm that was used to hold her tongue. Shortly after this, it was claimed that a parcel of hair was found at the door to Christian Shaw's chamber, and this was quickly thrown in the fire to dispel its effects. Later that evening, witnesses claimed to hear a conversation between Christian Shaw and something that offered her food and drink, and that should she take them, she would never again be bothered by her complaints. But Christian was reported to have refused. She then went blind and deaf for 2 hours, but continued to speak. It was suggested that the devil had appeared to her and offered her a means to stop the torment, saying that her faith would not help her. This struggle went on for hours. Christian claimed that a spirit was talking to her above her head. When the devil vanished, the voice told her that one of her tormentors would visit her the very next day. So this is now the 13th of February, 1697. Christian went into a terrible fit, and she believed she was no longer in her home, and she was unable to answer any questions put to her. It was then that a local woman named Margaret Roger came to the house. When Margaret Roger arrived, Christian suddenly rushed over to her and was able to talk to her. She begged Margaret to take her away, as she believed her mother and father had abandoned her. At this point, the other confessors, who were still in custody on the Bargarin estate, were brought up to the room, and Christian seemed overjoyed to see them. They then agreed that not only was Margaret Roger involved, but the confessors stated that she had been to Bargarin Orchard nearby, meeting with the devil and witches to plot Christian Shaw's ruin. The next day, on the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, bummer, Christian had another fit and screamed in agony, claiming that Margaret Lang and Martha Semple were cutting her throat. Her body doubled over and her head and feet touched the floor at the same time. Her stomach swelled like a drum and she repeatedly fell onto her head so many times that witnesses feared she would never speak again. When the fit lifted, Christian Shaw said that Margaret Lang had told her during the episode that she would be given a toastie. No, not cheese and toast, Martin. A toastie referred to hot and severe handling. During the next 4 days, she had numerous episodes, saying terrible things during them and claiming that she feared God himself would turn her back on her. Then, on the 18th of February, a terrifying event occurred. Christian Shaw said that the devil began appearing to her in the shape of a man in broad daylight. What followed was allegedly a terrible struggle between Christian Shaw and invisible creatures, at which point she cried out, "The bumby has stinged me!" Bumby is hilarious, but it's a shorter version of Bumblebee.
Okay, alright, okay.
After this, witnesses claimed to see deeply imprinted fingernail marks on the skin of Christian Shaw. During this fit, Christian claimed to hear the voice from above her, and it now spread the accusations of witchcraft further afield. It said that the person responsible for the attack was a member of a neighbouring parish. This person, with the initials MM, was the thing that took the form of a bumblebee and attacked her. The devil appeared to her again as a gentleman, and Christian screamed that he was trying to entice her to be a witch. In Christian's mind then, her being coerced into being a witch, this must have been the motivation all along. I think there's the implication here that with the devil appearing in broad daylight and as a fully formed man, that his dominion over her is kind of increasing. Christian Shaw was reported to say to the devil at this point, "Thou fearest me more than I fearest thee." In response, something with teeth bit her hand, and she was pinched by invisible hands for several minutes, screeching in pain each time this happened. The mysteriously named MM then told Christian Shaw that she was being punished for having Margaret Lang taken into custody, and that MM herself was under the control of Margaret Lang. In the following days, Christian Shaw was continually bitten and scratched by apparent unseen attackers, and on several occasions there were the marks of teeth with, and I quote, "the spittle and slaver of a mouth."
Oof.
Yeah, not pretty. Another mysterious figure appeared to Christian, a crooked man with, as described in this account, deformed feet. It was then suggested that there was indeed a man in a neighbouring parish who had feet just like this, and that he had previously been accused of being in league with the devil. The prisoners at Bargarin said that this man had been seen at the Bargarin orchard during meetings with the devil. On February 20th, we have a new phenomenon recorded, and this does again link into modern descriptions of alleged poltergeist activity, like we mentioned in the previous episode. A great quantity of peat turf apparently caught fire when no fire was near it, damaging the walls that surrounded it, but bizarrely not spreading further. Again reminiscent of some poltergeist claims and even spontaneous human combustion, where the surrounding area isn't as affected as you would think it should be. After this, there was an instance where fire ash apparently vanished without a trace, having been there the night before scattered across a floor. The interpretation of fire here is either at the service of the witches or indicative of some unseen entity has its roots in ancient mythology. Numerous forms of hell, Hades or the equivalent have been described using fire as an essential element. The devil himself in a modern context is depicted as red, as if burned by fire, and even when we go back to the use of the word black in the context of being covered in soot, we can see this deep connection to fire as an emblem of evil for many. It consumes the world, it can kill, it can produce a black choking smoke, and all of this occurs outside of the, in inverted commas, natural order, where God, divinity, or humankind as an extension of that divinity, controls the fire and brings it to heal. When that natural order is broken, malevolent agency, like that of a coven or the devil himself, is free to cause harm and mischief with it. Fire as an elemental force has been seen both as a life giver and a destroyer throughout different mythological and spiritual teachings, even going back to ancient Sumer. Yes, I'm on a tangent here. Just as an aside, the history of fire gods is fascinating. The fire god, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, I'm going to say probably Gibel, was mentioned over 5,000 years ago and was said to be responsible for the burning of crops. While I'm sceptical about the accounts here, one does wonder if there's something in some of these old stories going back thousands of years, but I'll move away from that for now for fear of bringing down some fiery horror.
Wait, your boiler wouldn't go off earlier on, Michael?
Fucking hell. You're right. That's it. We're all gonna die. After the fires, Christian Shaw then went on to name the crooked man who kept terrorising her as J.R., not from Dallas. There's an outdated reference for you, Martin, again. Christian continually spat out metal pins from her mouth at this point and claimed JR was the one putting them there. She also said a small Highland man was breaking her leg, which caused her to scream in agony. Spectators claimed that they then saw a large bruise on Christian's shin bone. The Highland man had also placed a crooked pin inside of her throat, trying to choke her. Throughout the first 8 days of March, these episodes continued, until one night, when the window to Christian's room blew open with an icy wind, she claimed the Highland man and a gentlewoman had entered the house through this gust of wind. After this, Christian was well enough for a few hours to attend church. While there, she said that she saw the faces. How would you pronounce this second name, Martin? W-A-U-G-H?
Bumby. Wach or Wach.
Right, that's how I would have pronounced it. I should have just went for it. Now I'm second guessing myself. How do you pronounce T-H-E? While there, she said that she saw the face of Janet Wach and several others peering through the church windows to those sitting inside. This very much sounds like the evildoers not being able to set foot on hallowed ground. In fact, throughout this case, and I think we may have mentioned it in the previous episode, whether it be hallowed ground or religious words, the dominion of God is still implied to be more powerful than the devil. We see this every time someone recites a passage from the Bible and the reaction it provokes in Christian Shaw herself. Throughout the rest of March, Christian continued having fits, producing pins from her mouth and showing claw marks on her arms. At the same time, a band of individuals had come together, led by a brave local sheriff, to seek out the rest of Christian Shaw's tormentors to put an end to her suffering. There are various in-depth descriptions of Christian's continuing ordeal here, but most of it is almost identical to what went on before. In mid-March, however, she claimed that the apparitions of dead children were visiting her, which is an image no one quite wants in their head. Another incident involved the devil coming to her naked, with hair across the back of his hands and swine bristles on his face, which I believe are sharp, stiff hairs that usually grow on the backs and sides of pigs. Christian claimed that the devil was trying to tempt her away from her faith.
Nothing's more tempting than a big naked guy with hairy hands and spines on his face. Hold me back.
What if I had more bristles? Eh?
Still not enough bristles?
I'm wiggling my eyebrows up and down as I say that, Martin, just for the full effect. What if I had bristles on my balls? How about that?
Hairy hands aren't good enough? What about hairy backs of knees?
No. There are again quoted passages here of Christian rebuking the devil no matter what he did to her. Again, as we mentioned in our first episode, it seems unlikely that a girl of her age would have spoken so perfectly, never mind the fact that all of this must have been recorded from memory in many circumstances, or by ministers who aren't exactly neutral in all of this. This was the final confrontation with the devil. On March 27th, Christian begged God to save her, and the account finishes with this quote: "On Sabbath morning, being March 28th, the damsel, through God's great mercy towards her, was perfectly recovered, both of all her sore and light fits, becoming as well, sensible and composed as ever." This ends the narrative of Christian Shaw. We're only halfway, by the way, Martin. It sounds like I'm concluding there. It's a fascinating and harrowing account, but it's what happened next that is, in many ways, most chilling. In the later editions of A History of the Witches of Renfrewshire, there is subsequent material added alongside the original texts that I'd found. I discovered these later editions after the first episode was recorded. This more clearly explains that the account you have heard, drawn from the records of the presbytery at Paisley and other testimonies from those involved, appeared as a published pamphlet titled The True Narrative of the Sufferings and Relief of a Young Girl. In Charles Kirkpatrick Sharp's A Historical Account of the Belief in Witchcraft in Scotland, which he wrote in the early 1800s, he states that this information was collated by the town clerk of Glasgow during the trials, and then written by an advocate, knight and lord of session, Mr. Francis Grant. Mr. Francis Grant has quite a lot of titles. Sharp gives the full title of the pamphlet here as A True Narrative of the Sufferings and Relief of a Young Girl, strangely molested by evil spirits and their instruments in the West, collected from authentic testimonies thereanent and see, which I think altogether means basically all the strange things that happened, etc.
I would just say as well, until quite recently, the word molested didn't necessarily mean sexually.
Yeah. It's confusing then where some of these testimonies come from and how exactly they were collated. But I would add several editions of A History of the Witches of Renfrewshire by John Miller have attached many appendices subsequently. These include letters and other communications and observations about the case. So for those interested, they are well worth your time. I feel like I've tried to give as best a summary of what happened, what allegedly happened to Christian Shaw as I could. But trust me, this could have been 3 or 4 episodes. So I hope I've covered all the critical details.
Yeah, there's so much to it, really, isn't there?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Especially when I came to writing this episode and researching this episode. It just grew arms and legs. I was actually a bit overwhelmed because of these subsequent editions of that book. And I was finding other sources. It just was expanding and expanding and expanding. And there has to be a cut-off point. But I'm hoping that I've covered all the critical details of the alleged phenomena and the early investigation that was carried out. An interesting fact regarding that investigation is that it all but concluded just a few days before the cessation of Christian Shaw's symptoms. Believers in this case will argue that the symptoms ceased because Christian Shaw's tormentors could no longer carry out their witchcraft from where they were held. Disbelievers will say that it ceased because everyone Christian Shaw had issues with had more or less been put away awaiting trial, and there was no need for Christian to put on the act any longer. Reading through the presbytery records, it becomes increasingly apparent as the investigation concluded that the ministers and other members of the church were actively involved in not just trying to make sense of Christian Shaw's suffering, but in extracting confessions from the accused.
It feels a bit like a feeding frenzy
Absolutely.
Of accusations at certain points.
There's a real sense of hysteria sweeping the area at that time, and it seems that the clergy either got swept along with it or accelerated its growth. On April 14th of 1697, there's an interesting declaration within the records where there is a meeting amongst the local clergy where there is a revising of Christian Shaw's narrative. They pore over the details, put it in order, and then a man named Turner transcribes copies of what has been agreed. I can't help but feel that here is where any embellishment may have taken place, particularly when recording the exact biblical quotations and musings Christian Shaw reportedly spoke during her episodes. And really, when you're reading these documents, there'll be like full pages of exact quotes of what Christian Shaw was saying, and a lot of this seems very unlikely. Yeah,
in some ways this is propaganda. It's propaganda for a particular religious view of the world. There's going to be a temptation there to go, well, I'll just correct that just to make the message a little bit clearer, just tidy this up a little bit to make the message a little bit more obvious, and that is obviously going to lead to a honing and a sort of adaptation of what she originally said at best, if not complete fabrication in some cases. On April 15th, this account was given to the commission investigating the case. Now, I'd like to summarise the investigation, the trial and the aftermath. There isn't as much information about those aspects of the case as the actual account of Christian Shaw's suffering itself, but I'll do my best.
It was through the Presbytery's own petition that a commission was formed. This took place in early February of that year. The commission was chaired by Lord Blantyre. Those who watched our videos on the Blantyre carvings on the Ghastly Tales YouTube channel will recognise that name. The commission took into account all of the testimonies and the records produced by the local clergy and concluded that there was reason to believe the claims were true. Across our description of Christian Shaw's accusations, you'll have noticed many names. I couldn't find the exact number, but the BBC stated in an article a few years ago that 30 people were either named or brought before the commission. In Michael Wasser's The Western Witch Hunt of 1697 to 1700, the last major witch hunt in Scotland, he claims to have found 35 individuals who were named by Christian Shaw.
Oh, they were handing out accusations like sweeties.
Yeah, absolutely. It just spread, and it spread throughout all of the communities nearby. It wasn't just around Bargaran. Despite this, the commission concluded that only 7 of these should face trial. Now, considering the overt religious influence in this investigation and subsequent trial, it seems to me that the number 7 might have some form of significance. It's a symbolic number in many traditions, including in Abrahamic religions. In Christianity, it is, of course, seen in the 7 deadly sins. Were these 7 chosen for that very reason, or it might just have been a coincidence? But consider this. Throughout Christian Shaw's episodes, the local church decided to order its congregation to fast often and to also humiliate themselves in front of God. I'm not paraphrasing. I don't know what that entailed, but it was a way for those in the local community to try to combat satanic influence. It may just have been humbling themselves by bowing, I'm not exactly sure what was involved.
Yeah, I've got a feeling that humiliate maybe is one of these words that had a slightly different meaning originally, like maybe meant to sort of give up pride or something.
Yeah.
Like mortification of the flesh doesn't mean you were embarrassed. I got pure riddy, you know what I meant?
I've not heard of pure riddy and I don't know how long.
Yeah, so I think it meant like going into a state of being humbled rather than a state of doing something really embarrassing necessarily, although like it's become more specific now.
Yeah.
I think.
But when you're reading the documents about this whole active fasting seems to be a huge part of how the local churches were trying to counteract the alleged evil that was taking place against Christian Shaw. And of course, when people fast, sometimes they see things, it can affect the way that you perceive the world around you. So, who knows if that played into this. But looking at the 7, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that the 7 of the 30 to 35 accused were chosen to face trial based perhaps on some religious significance. This alleged coven of 7 then consisted of Agnes Naismith and Catherine Campbell, the 2 initial people accused. Then they were joined by John Lindsay and James Lindsay, the 2 brothers who were known as Bishop and Curate, though there is some controversy about this that we will get into in a minute. Margaret Lang and Margaret Fulton, perhaps the 2 Maggies Christian Shaw had mentioned, and finally John Reed, who I believe was referred to earlier as JR. The man defending the 7, James Robertson, tried to argue that the only way the accused could be found guilty was if other causes could be ruled out. It's like we talked about earlier, that's why a lot of witch trials ceased across Europe, because people couldn't differentiate between what's a supernatural element and what's a natural element. So this seems to be the defence that was put out.
Yeah.
You have to be able to prove that what's happening to Christian Shaw was not the result of other things going on that we will also get into shortly. Unfortunately, this defence didn't hold, at least for the jury. After a minister named Hutchison was allowed to give a sermon to the court and give an impassioned, religiously rousing argument that they had to be witches, the jury was seemingly swayed. Apparently this was quite common. Ministers were allowed to address juries like this. Though admittedly, given the hysteria built up around the case, it might not have taken much. And it might have had something to do with the prosecutor threatening the jury by saying that if the jury acquitted the accused, they would be, and I quote, accessory to all the blasphemies, apostasies, murders, tortures, and seductions, etc., whereof those enemies of heaven and earth shall hereafter be guilty when they get out. That sounds ethical. In a time of superstition, the jury were told in court by the prosecutor that they would basically go to hell if they returned a not guilty verdict.
Yeah, there's no way they were ever going to choose anything else. I mean, what is the chances of them getting an unbiased jury in the first place? It sounds like everyone in the local area would know about this case and have an opinion. One opinion, not a variety of opinions. The chances of getting a fair trial there were surely next to nil.
And probably be worried that you're going to get, fingered for it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
because you're saying, well, hang on a minute, guys. She is only 11 years old. Maybe some of this is just imagination in there.
Them's witching words, yeah. Exactly.
I know. Needless to say, all 7 were found guilty, and their punishment was that they were to be hanged or garroted and then burned on June 10th, 1697. Before this happened, one of the accused, John Reed, hanged himself in his cell with a handkerchief tied to a nail in a wall. I've seen in different books and web sources John being referred to as James, so I don't know if there's some confusion here. The number of executed also changes in places, believe it or not, between 6 and 5, depending on the source. The confusion around the names is something that has really bothered me during the reading of this. It was reported that John Reed, the man who committed suicide, confessed to having been led to the orchard where the devil was by a large black hound with a chain around its neck. As he called them, the hags were there, referring to the women in the coven. They were then each offered the scorched remains of an unbaptised child's liver, the purpose of which was to protect them from confessing if apprehended. John Reed claimed he did not swallow the liver, in some attempt to perhaps show that he wasn't as complicit with the devil's plans. There is the suggestion in this account then that child sacrifice was happening in and around the Bargarin house. We can't of course rule that out. Child sacrifice still takes place today in some parts of the world. In Uganda, for example, there's good reason to believe that local witch doctors have been kidnapping children in order to murder them in a ritual to bring their clients wealth and good fortune. This has become such a widespread problem in some rural areas there that teachers and parents are constantly on guard around young children. The police have even created a new unit called the Anti-Human Sacrifice Police Task Force to apprehend those carrying out such horrendous crimes. And here in the UK, there have also been incidents of suspected child sacrifice, and it appears that these practices probably take place in most countries, though there is debate here in the UK about how widespread they are in reality. Some of these accusations have been a kind of satanic panic in many cases.
Yeah, that tends to be more of a outside of specific cases where you've got specific beliefs and belief around things like albino children as well.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
But typically it's a form of blood libel, not to open this can of worms, but look at stuff like, I'm sure you've read the whole kind of, the Democrats are eating children and all that sort of shit.
QAnon, yeah.
Yeah, it's used to smear people, it's a common thing. But also I think in witch accusations, when you go back to these, such and such a person was found with the severed hand of a hanged man and that kind of thing, it almost kind of always glosses over where the object came from.
Yeah.
Almost as if there's the implication that someone has been killed in order to produce this, but there's also the secondary implication that was this arrived by supernatural means. Is this an old one that's been in storage somewhere in a witch's hovel somewhere, that kind of thing. Yeah, you see that quite a lot. Certainly read other cases where they just casually say, oh yeah, we believe they had this object. Wait a minute, how would they have got that object? Why are you not discussing where that would have come from?
Yeah.
But they never really go there, never
get to that,
touch on it. Yeah.
Yeah. You think of situations where, corrupt officials, instead of planting drugs on people, oh, look what I found here, a wee bag of cocaine in the back seat of your car. What's this? It's like, oh, there's a hanged man's head in the back of your car. Where did this come from, eh?
He's got a wee bag of hanged man's heads in the back.
Yeah. Which one will we give him?
Beardy or baldy?
Going back to the trial, John Reed's confession, while suggesting child sacrifice, still should be looked upon, in my opinion, with great scepticism, as should any of the confessions, which were all procured under duress. During the executions, the most striking image that is reported in a number of sources, and the one that I have to say has haunted me for some time, is what allegedly happened where the Lindsay brothers were hanged on the Gallows Green in Paisley. On that day, 10th of June 1697, they were hanged together. They were murdered together. And it was murder, though state-sanctioned.
Yeah.
Some sources report that James was 14 years old, John was 11 years old, and as they were hanged, the two brothers held hands to comfort each other.
That's tragic.
It's a horrific image. I really wouldn't be surprised if it is true. Life was cheaper back then, and the murder of children happened a lot more often than it does now.
Yeah.
Also, in the eyes of contemporaries, at 11 and 14, they may not have been seen as children by some.
Exactly. I think at 14, most people were working at that age.
Yeah, but now here's where it gets really complicated. In recent years, there has been the claim that there was a mix-up in the reporting of the execution of the Lindsay brothers. Though some accounts claim that it was indeed the young Lindsay brothers, the names change throughout some of these reports. If you cast your mind back, the first time we see mention of one of the young Lindsay brothers, he's not referred to as John or James, he's referred to as Thomas.
Right.
So what does all of this mean? Well, some argue now that what actually happened is that the two younger Lindsay brothers had an, as of yet, unidentified fate. Were they executed? Were they perhaps murdered by mob violence? Were they imprisoned? Were they sent to one of the colonies? I'm not sure. And as far as I can tell, no one else is either. What some argue is that the story is still true. Two Lindsay brothers were executed, but that they weren't children. They were the father and uncle of the younger Lindsay brothers. This explains why the names are different in some instances. It's still argued that the two older brothers either held hands or locked arms as they were executed, which is still a profoundly tragic image of brotherly love. It's possible that the reporting of two children being executed was included for shock value in the pamphlets that circulated at the time, or the Lindsay brothers were reported as children by later writers and commentators so that they could cast even more dispersion on those who organised the witch trials, or maybe it's just been a bizarre clerical error and it's been picked up and passed along throughout the centuries. So I can't say in confidence that the children were executed, and some are now outright reporting that it was the older Lindsay men, though I don't have the sources currently myself to state that as absolute fact.
I wonder if there would be official record of that somewhere, but you probably have to go somewhere like the National Archives to find it.
Yeah, it seems to be round about 2012. It seems to have been started to have been mentioned in a number of different articles where people say that this is a correction, but I don't see, or I haven't seen any example of where that correction comes from. But I do know firsthand from reading these accounts that the names change depending on the sources at different times, and so it does get confusing. So I mean, I could easily have made errors here as well because names were changing. So if I have made errors, please do point them out. Back to the others who were executed. Margaret Fulton, who was also hanged on that day, seems to have had some sort of mental breakdown. It was recorded that she seemed in good spirits and seemed to believe that she was going to meet the fairies to visit Elfland and to be taken there on the backs of magical horses. By modern standards, this might seem like a very strange flight of fancy, but you have to remember that in Scotland, our folklore, our mythology, is widely immersed in ideas of the fairy folk. Now, these aren't the tiny happy Disney creations people think of today when they hear of a fairy, but they range from what's known as silly or happy fairies to unseelie or malevolent creatures, essentially. But this is a topic we will definitely return to because the fairy folklore of Scotland is fascinating and sometimes outright terrifying. But just to reiterate here, having a delusion about fairies in Scotland, especially back in the 1600s, would be no stranger than someone with schizophrenia having a fixation on Christianity or another popular religion today. Margaret Lang confessed to having consorted with the devil before being hanged, but renounced him and said she had reconciled with God. We might take this confession as startling evidence. Maybe there was witchcraft going on, but gallows confessions like these were not unheard of, and it's likely that they were given, in my opinion, because the individual had family and didn't want their name to be associated with satanic practices, perhaps in the hope that they would be admonished of any other things they were ashamed of in their lives and be welcomed into heaven, or maybe they'd even been persuaded to believe that they were somehow involved when they weren't.
Yeah. I think you have to remember the time in which this is happening and also the positions in which the people who are talking to them have in society. The clergy have this kind of all-important, unassailable position. A lot of these people were illiterate, probably.
Yeah.
And the source of knowledge, the source of teaching in the community was usually the clergy, and they have the truth of God behind them. So if the clergy is saying something and you've been beaten up and threatened and tortured for a confession, and there's a clergyman saying, you're a witch, you've done this, you can kind of understand how someone might start to question and even doubt their own reality and their own, the evidence of their own senses in that circumstance, in that situation. You know, you might start to think, oh, maybe by some enchantment I've forgotten what I did, and actually I did do this because, well, the priest knows everything and the whole community seems to know that I did it. The fact that I don't remember doing it maybe is irrelevant, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, very true. This brings us to Catherine Campbell, the maid who was first accused of witchcraft by Christian Shaw, and to Agnes Naismith, an older woman in the local community who was the second person to have been accused right back at the beginning of this entire ordeal. Catherine was dragged to the gallows screaming and trying to free herself. It was recorded that she then wished that the wrath of God and the devil be brought down upon her accusers. Agnes Naismith gave what was known as a dying woman's curse. She cursed not only all those watching her execution, but also their descendants. This curse we'll get back to in a moment. But if these proceedings weren't grisly enough, there are accounts that after the accused had been hanged, that they were placed into a bonfire and burned. As they burned, the bodies allegedly writhed and moved. Some, at least, were not dead. One of the executioners allegedly borrowed a walking stick from a man named Mark Canavan to prod the moving bodies back into the fire whenever they attempted to escape the flames.
Gruesome.
Mark Canavan, understandably, didn't want the walking stick back after that.
He limped home.
I know, that's it. And he was carried home.
And he fell and broke his neck.
He didn't want something that had been touched by a witch, apparently. And what of Christian Shaw? What happened to her? She married into the church, marrying a Reverend John Miller. During a trip to the Netherlands, she allegedly, with her mother, stole examples of Dutch thread, smuggling them out of the country on her person. One wonders if those skills, being able to conceal things, were involved in the debacle of her alleged supernatural attacks. That's something that I found out at the very last minute, basically when this was already, I was reading some stuff after I'd completed most of my research, and I found that mentioned somewhere, and I was just like, oh, that is interesting. She returned to Paisley. Some suggest studying the thread and how it was made, and then became famous.
The twist is she actually used witchcraft to teleport it back to Scotland.
Yeah, there you go. She created techniques used to manufacture thread that became world-renowned. And those techniques revolutionised how thread was made, creating an entire industry in Paisley and the surrounding areas. Christian's first husband died 2 years after they wed. The last known record of Christian Shaw, as published by Renfrewshire Council themselves, was that in 1737 she married a prosperous businessman named William Livingston. One note that makes me very uncomfortable, and it's a revelation I alluded to in the first episode, and noticed in some of the editions of The Witches of Renfrewshire, where the records of the presbytery and other contemporary accounts were published, that the name John Miller was attached to the documents. That seemed like a pretty big coincidence, as Christian Shaw married a Reverend John Miller, but the dates don't match up. Well, I recently discovered the subsequent edition which explains that many of these records were kept in family, and in fact that the grandson of the author of the book had the original manuscripts, probably in the late 1800s, though my dates might be off. I wonder then, is this a family name passed down? And has this entire book been created, at least originally, by descendants of Christian Shaw's first husband, John Miller? Perhaps even descendants of Christian Shaw herself. I'm not the only person to think that the coincidence of the name is pretty striking. In fact, I'd like to thank Lorraine, one of our listeners, who mentioned this to me in an email after the first episode went live. I was intending on covering this strange coincidence, but Lorraine had other pieces of information I wasn't aware of, so I hope she doesn't mind me quoting a paragraph from the email. Lorraine wrote, "I have read Miller's book and find it very interesting and agree with your take on the bias. He was a professor of law at Glasgow University and wrote other books on various topics, but what I found to be a strange coincidence, he shares the same name as Christian Shaw's first husband, Reverend John Miller." So thanks so much for that, Lorraine, and if anyone else has info about this, I'd love to hear it at talkingtilldawn@gmail.com. Now, let's quickly move on to the aftermath of the trials and executions. Over 140 years later, during the mid-1800s, the story of Christian Shaw's apparent torment and the resulting witch trials had become something of a local tourist attraction. People visited Bargarin House to see for themselves the chamber of Christian Shaw, where the unseen malevolent hands of the devil and his minions allegedly tore at her skin and thrust her into repeated fits and seizures. A place where objects would appear from Christian's mouth like pins and hair, and no one had any idea how she would have had access to those items herself. But in 1839 it was discovered that in one of the walls of Christian Shaw's chambers, her bedroom, that there was a small hole. And it has been suggested by Rosemary Ellen Gilley, a researcher of witchcraft and its history, that the hole in the wall was most probably used by someone else in the house to pass these miraculous items that appeared from Christian Shaw as if from nowhere. And to me, this is one of the most terrifying aspects of the case. Christian was a child herself, but it seems very likely that someone, perhaps even an adult, was deliberately encouraging Christian Shaw to claim that her symptoms were the direct result of witchcraft, claims that resulted in the defamation and possible torture of 35 people and the eventual deaths of 7 people and the unknown fate of 2 children. MacDonald et al. In an article for the Scottish Medical Journal argues that Christian Shaw may have suffered from conversion disorder, where a person's anxieties can manifest as physical symptoms, so it could have been possible that Christian's seizures were neither supernatural or the product of epilepsy. They could have been produced simply by the pressures exerted upon her by the adults questioning her every thought about the allegations she had made.
If it was a knowing lie, there must have been a sense of power to be able to deceive all of these powerful people, you know, judges, ministers, real leaders in the community were taken in by this. So there must have been a real buzz from that, from tricking everyone. Yeah,
not knowing the consequences.
Yeah, or not caring. You know, people with personality disorders and maybe a bit of psychopathy. I'm not saying that's the case, but these are all possibilities, I think.
It's also been suggested in Michael Wasser's book, The Western Witch Hunt of 1697 to 1700 that I mentioned earlier, that witch trials often occurred during moments of social or existential threat. There was a widespread fear regarding the fading of religion at that time, and there's no better way to reinforce religion than with a demonic evil that needs to be fought. There were also questions of Scotland's declining morality after the infamous Glencoe massacre just 5 years before this case, and worries over a potential French invasion. Now, there were also harvest failures in 1695, and I do wonder about that. Could there have been a resurgence in folk traditions that Christianity may have deemed pagan to bring an end to that famine? I don't think that can be ruled out. Certainly there may have been some strange practices going on that lit the touch paper of this case, an intolerance to those who were different and held different beliefs. Of course, Christian Shaw was a child herself, and so I can't put the blame at her door. We don't know what was made up and what was a genuine symptom of her condition. The blame should be placed on her parents, the clergy, the doctors, and the other allegedly esteemed individuals who vouched for the veracity of the witchcraft claims, and on those who allowed the accused to be executed within the courts, not to mention the royal decrees which made witch executions legal.
Saying that though, if, for example, she did know it wasn't real and that she was being fed names by an adult and being trained to do essentially tricks to fool the clergy, to fool the law, as a child, okay, you can kind of forgive that because they don't really know necessarily the full connotations of what happened, but this is someone who went on to become quite a powerful, wealthy woman, and I would say there probably does come a point where you go, well, we can actually blame this person because they didn't then come forward and say that this happened when I was younger and I may have got these people killed. You know, you're right, like in that moment as she's a child, you can't really blame her for it, but if it was a deception,
yeah,
I think you can still judge her on that because she lived a full and happy life after that and didn't own up to what happened, didn't confess, as far as we know anyway. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm not saying she was knowingly deceiving anyone, but if she was knowingly deceiving everyone, the fact that she just let that go, you know.
She may have had to persuade herself that it was real to live with the guilt.
Yeah, well, maybe.
But yeah, that's a really interesting point about, you know, what did Christian Shaw say about this in later years? I haven't seen anything about that.
Yeah.
And it was such a widely known case. And the fact that she became famous for thread manufacturing, you wonder if it was brought up and if people talked about it again to her later, if there's anything written down about that. It'd be fascinating to read it.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, what of the curse of Paisley? This is the bit you've all been waiting for. Remember, both Catherine Campbell and Agnes Naismith cursed the town, and Naismith especially cursed the descendants of those involved in their execution.
Lots of people have cursed Paisley over the years, Michael.
Yeah. Even those who are watching were damned. It might seem in bad taste to put our speculation hats on and talk about supernatural claims here, but if we are always to leave the door open just a smidge for being wrong, then we must look at the claims made about the curse of the Paisley Witches. There are two competing claims about this curse. One is that the curse has directly been involved in a number of tragedies and disasters throughout Paisley's history ever since the executions. Like any place, Paisley has been the site of tragedies, and it has to be said, for a town, now a city of less than 80,000 souls, it's had its fair share. The Paisley Canal boat accident of 1810, where 84 people were killed, has been particularly attributed to the Paisley curse, as have other disasters like the 1929 Glen Cinema disaster, where 70 children were crushed to death on Hogmanay, an explosion at a factory in 1964 killing 4 men, and the Nazi bombing of Paisley on April 7th and 8th, 1941, killing 97 people. I believe the single biggest loss of life on Scottish soil during the Second World War. Again, that has been attributed to the curse. Others claim that the curse didn't really get going until the 1960s. You see, the remains of the burned accused were buried at a crossroads. Now, I have not seen direct mention of this, but I do know that there are old superstitions, which I think we've talked about before, Martin, where people have been either executed or buried at crossroads in the hopes that the vengeful spirits get disorientated and can't find their way for revenge. Crossroads are also implicitly connected to the devil and the thin boundary between the physical and spiritual realms. Perhaps it was hoped that the devil would claim their souls and take them away without any further trouble. Regardless, the remains were buried at McWelton Cross in Paisley, and the only mark to show that this had been done was a horseshoe set into the stone road above that spot. This was believed to keep restless souls and evil malevolence at bay.
Very folk horror.
Yeah. There's a lot of literature about why horseshoes were used, but one theory, and it's one that I think is very likely, is that these horseshoes were made of iron, and iron has long been associated with vanquishing evil. It's why iron stakes and poles have been driven into the ground throughout Europe in the hope to keep vampires and ghosts at bay. It's why iron gates and iron fences were used to surround some cemeteries and other buildings. And even in modern folklore, some have argued that iron works against alleged spirits because they are essentially electromagnetic in nature, and iron has powerful electromagnetic properties, which is why it's often used in the production of engines and magnets. So an iron horseshoe was placed in that spot until the 1960s, when it was removed by road crews. It's said that Paisley underwent a terrible decline financially and industrially after that moment, and some have argued that Paisley only began to recover when the horseshoe was put back where it belonged, along with a memorial seal in 2008 carrying the inscription, "Pain inflicted, suffering endured, injustice done." Over time, the new horseshoe began to loosen because the seal still sits in the middle of a crossroad. And I know that crossroad well because I had a driving instructor in Paisley for a time after this, and I used to drive directly over that very seal over and over again as I learned the test routes there. In fact, my driving instructor would take me on a cyclical route, and so I kept having to return to that crossroads again and again, and it was actually a little unnerving knowing what was beneath the rolling wheels of our car. In 2012, the seal was reset again as the horseshoe was loose. One wonders if the horseshoe has been included because city officials believe in the curse, or is it purely for tradition's sake? I, personally, am sceptical of the curse.
Yeah, it's like the Economic Recovery Committee, right? What are we going to do? Well, we could put that horseshoe back again.
I've been thinking about it. Let's just put it back. If curses are even remotely possible, then I could imagine the curse of the murdered, especially the falsely accused, might carry some weight down the road. And as I've been writing and researching this case, another chapter in the Paisley Witch trials has unfolded. The Scottish Government has issued a formal apology to the public and to the victims of the Witchcraft Act of 1563, when, over many subsequent decades, as many as 4,000 people were tortured and a large portion of them executed. However, those involved in the Witches of Scotland campaign are still hoping that an official pardon will come. And I think it will. I hope it will. Though it can never truly erase the pain and horror of the superstition, accusations and barbarity that so callously ended so many lives prematurely. It's a warning from history. Never allow yourself to be caught up in the mob and in its insatiable desires, because you just don't know where it will end. Your thoughts, Mr. Yates?
Yeah, it's really poignant. Yeah, it really does feel to me much less like I think I said this in the last episode, but much less like a supernatural case and much more like a lesson, really. As you say, like a lesson against being swept along in superstition, it being swept along with the mob, beliefs being weaponized. And yeah, I think it's a chilling case. Obviously, there's these kind of ancillary sort of paranormal elements, but really, I mean, you look at any town, there's going to be incidents where people are killed, terrible things happen. You know, do we say there's a Mariupol curse? Do we say there's an Auschwitz curse? No.
Yeah.
There's nothing really makes Paisley. Things much worse happened elsewhere. To me, that serves more as a kind of folk memory that a terrible thing happened here, that when other terrible things happen, we're reminded of it. To me, that's the significance of those beliefs, rather than something that I think is sort of a real, force acting on the town. One thing that strikes me about this is that Christian herself sort of exists in an uncomfortable place between being a potential victim of terrible persecution, supernatural or otherwise, and also being a potential perpetrator of horrific persecution. That makes this whole case makes the moral landscape of this case quite difficult to navigate.
Yeah.
There's 2 or 3 different Christian Shaws here, in a way. There's 2 or 3 different implied possible Christian Shaws. There's the sort of saintly victim. There's the pawn in a kind of religious or personal feud type game, and there's the kind of histrionic, manipulative psychopath version that you could also imagine operating within these events. It reminds me a little bit of, is it Rashomon, the film where someone is murdered and there's the recollections of different people and they've all got different perspectives that can be quite contradictory. So the different interpretations of what happened completely change how you view Christian. Completely, she could be the worst villain, or she could be the most undeserving victim imaginable. So yeah, that makes it quite tricky, not to get your head around, but it makes it quite tricky to come to a final decision on her, to come to a judgment on her. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And you don't know who, like if someone's put her up to it, you don't know the fact that that hole that was found in the wall, the fact that she and her mother allegedly were smuggling things on their person. When you look at that sort of stuff, it does make you think, if they were Because that hole might not have been for that, but it seems pretty suspect.
I mean, I guess there's a lot of holes in a lot of walls, so, you know, maybe doesn't prove anything. But was there not, if I recall correctly, was there not some aspersion cast on the mother in the first episode of this? Maybe not directly, but did we not discuss there was something fishy about the mother's involvement?
I think the parents in general, both of them.
Yeah.
It's terrible. I'd have to actually go back and look at my notes in the first episode. There's been so much like reading and research for this in comparison to, I mean, I've done a lot for the other episodes that I've done, but this
takes the cake.
Yeah, and it's been over many months that there's probably stuff that I've forgotten about it.
You'd be glad to see the back of it.
To be honest, yeah. I mean, it's also opened up doors to loads of other really interesting episodes.
Yeah.
Especially, you know, I found a book that's a kind of history of witchcraft trials in Scotland, and there's loads of stuff there that I think would be really interesting to talk about in other episodes. But I would really like to I really want to do the Skinwalker episodes, but I think
that's going to be a long episode though.
It's going to be more than one episode because they've released another book.
Yeah.
But I've been doing research on it, I've been watching the TV series on it, I've watched several documentaries on it, I've read the original book by George Knapp, and there's this new book that came out last year. So I think if we do the Skinwalkers episodes, it'll probably be like an ongoing thing because they're self-contained enough where you could do one and then, you know, 6 months later do another one on it, but I think it'd be like 3 or 4 episodes over time.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that.
But I'm wanting to do like a standalone shorter episode, you know, like an hour length.
Yeah, for sure.
Something fun, you know, something fun, cryptids or something. No one getting burned. No brothers. I mean, that image of the two brothers holding hands as they get hanged, it really upset me.
Yeah, it's sad.
I don't know if it's just the way I've been feeling recently, but like maybe it changes when you're a dad, I don't know, but that just really got to me, and it was an image that stuck in my head for a long time. Even if it wasn't children, even if it was the two older brothers, the two brothers trying to comfort each other, to me that just summed up how I feel about this case really, which is that it's just a tragedy throughout for everyone.
Yeah, in a lot of cases as well, it's just wrong place at the wrong time, catching the wrong person's eye, and living in the wrong time period.
Exactly, yeah.
Just finding yourself in the midst of this. That's quite terrifying.
Exactly, but I also think that, I mean, I really mean what I said there at the end of that. It is a warning. These things are a warning. I know it took place hundreds of years ago, and it feels very disconnected from the world that we live in now, but I remember during the 90s, I think it was, where there was newspapers started naming and shaming paedophiles in the UK. I don't know if we talked about this at one point, but if memory serves me right, there were people who were named who had nothing to do with it. People were turning up at their houses.
Yeah. We can arrive at doing terrible things from a starting point of wanting the right thing, you know. The
road to hell's littered with good intentions.
Yes, exactly. They believed in the existence of witchcraft. That was an unassailable truth for them. And of course, like, you know, if real powers of witchcraft and negative influence existed, it'd be a horrific thing and someone would need to deal with that. So some of these actors, you know, not all of them necessarily, but some of them were genuinely trying to help people and save people. But this is why checks and balances are really, really important in any sort of legal system. It's why maintaining good, fair trials, even for people we are absolutely convinced are guilty, is necessary. Why, you know, beating confessions out of people isn't acceptable, even if we quote unquote know that they did it. If there's no doubt in our mind, we still should follow the protocol. We should still do things right. At that time, they didn't even, I guess, have that protocol. They didn't have the legal system that we would recognise today, but you do see that bloodlust in people. You know, people go, you know, burn their house down, find them, string them up, do this and that. It's like, it's natural to feel that way about things, and we all feel that way about things. And I think a lot of times, say for example, child abusers or murderers, people like to get into almost one-upmanship of what they would do if they caught him. You know, I would pull his guts out and stick the end down his throat, you know, and it gets more and more extreme, people trying to outdo each other and how gruesomely they would kill them. You get this in casual conversation about terrible crimes, but I guess I'm kind of getting at is that people think that when you go, like, maybe we shouldn't be chopping people into tiny wee bits before they've had a fair trial or whatever.
Yeah.
People think, why are you sticking up for an abuser but it's not about, to me, it's not about the person, you know, it's about protecting something in you.
Yeah.
Okay, we all feel rage and bloodlust and wish certain people were dead. We all feel that way sometimes, you know, that rage. But you can open doors to things by feeding that, and those doors are not necessarily healthy. They don't always lead to healthy places, even though you may be justified in wanting to do those things. Yeah. You can create reflexes in your own head that maybe eventually, if you feed those reflexes too often and too well, you maybe end up at a place where you're not that different. But, you know, that's my feeling on it anyway.
Yeah, and I also think, you know, we try and stay away from politics, but I certainly think that, for me anyway, when I look at like Twitter and places like that, there's a lot of it's okay to accuse people of things. I mean, I think it's okay to think someone's guilty or something before they've gone through a trial. I think that's fine, especially when sometimes the legal system and the way society is set up fails people, especially when it's failed some groups of people time and time and time again. But I still think that even with that being said, that due process is still absolutely essential. Yeah. Absolutely essential. And yes, you can say what you think, but as we try to do with the podcast, and I'm not trying to say that we are perfect examples of it, far from it, but no matter what you're talking about, I think always try to have at least a tiny amount of doubt. Everybody thinks they're an expert, and everybody thinks they have the certainty to be able to say something's absolutely true. Doubt is the most important part of analysing anything. Yeah. And if you keep that, if you keep it as sacred in yourself to have that little bit of doubt about things, then... But
carefully managed as well. Therein lies the trick.
Yeah, because you don't want to paralyse yourself. Yeah. You don't want to paralyse yourself with so much doubt that you never get anything done. Believe me, I've been there. Right? But I think having enough doubt, it's what stops people from flying planes into buildings.
Yeah.
You know, like if you've got enough doubt, just enough, it stops you, I think, from going to the absolute extreme a lot of the time. I'm sorry for our listeners, this has been so grim, but I have really enjoyed discussing it with you, mate, and I've really enjoyed researching it.
For as nasty as it is, I have enjoyed hearing all about it. I've been looking forward to the conclusion of this for a while, and it hasn't disappointed. It is a bizarre case, but it's a case that I guess, you know, is retold many times through history. You know, Salem and probably thousands upon thousands of times in cultures all over the world, and to this very day.
So a big thank you to all of you for listening. As always, please do check out our Patreon if you want to support the show, and we will be back soon with another topic. Maybe something a little bit more upbeat, maybe not, who knows. But as always, we'll be exploring the strange and the macabre. And Martin, the sun is coming up.
The sun is coming up. Take care, everybody.
Goodbye.